Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends in Germany. Thank you and welcome to today's session where we will be talking about the topic of turning crisis into opportunity. My name is Wei Min from SGInnovate. We are a Singapore government-owned organization that invests in and build deep tech innovations for the world. A good part of our work also involves building a global community of scientists, commercializing research, building deep tech talents, as well as working with our ecosystem partners in scaling deep tech for improving the lives of many around the world. With our partners in Germany, we have been having very strong collaborations over the years in building the ecosystem, creating many opportunities within the deep tech domain. Hence today, SGInnovate, together with the Singapore Embassy in Berlin and German Entrepreneurship Asia, are co-presenting this online webinar on the topic of turning crisis into opportunity, on how businesses and startups may survive in the new normal due to the coronavirus pandemic. With this, do allow me to pass the time to Dr. Andreas Schmidt, our moderator, to start off the session. Dr. Andreas, please.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much, Wei Min. All right, crisis, opportunity. When I talk to some of the startups I work with, for many, the crisis at the moment is first and foremost crisis and nothing else. If you think of it, you may have zero income. You need to fire people who are your friends, and then you write emails to your suppliers. I'll pay you later, maybe. Okay, so startup life is always tough, but at the moment it can be brutal. And what you do about it? Well, almost everything has been said about that. Many of you probably read the article from Sequoia, the legendary VC firm, that brought out this piece called Black Swan. And what were their recommendations for startup companies? Well, make sure you have enough cash. Thank you. I didn't realize that before. Revisit your sales forecast. People might buy less from you. Oh, really? Do you think? Reduce your marketing spend. Oh, nice idea. Throw your employees overboard, but make sure you don't sink the ship. So really, a lot of the tips out there at the moment, they're the basic one-on-one on startup survival. Not very creative, not uplifting. But then the other bit of almost the cliche that crisis is opportunity, it's true. Some of the biggest companies, the most successful ones we've ever seen, they were founded during crisis. Which ones spring to your mind? Yes, Microsoft, Apple, founded in 1975 during a big recession in the US. What about Groupon, Slack, both founded in the midst of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Airbnb, Square, Stripe, we have so many more examples. So today is not about the cliches, the doom, the gloom. Today is about learning from practitioners, experiences from true startup veterans, and we have invited 3 of them, and we invite you, everybody who is tuned in today, for our Q&A session later on. You see the chat function down there in your Zoom window. So whenever you have a question, just open the chat box, type it in, and Wei Min and the colleagues will go through your questions. We want a lively discussion later on, but before we introduce to you our speakers, here is the man who brought us all together today, the ambassador of Singapore to Germany. Here is Ambassador Laurence Fay. Hey, good morning.
Good morning, Andreas. I know you're in London.
I am in London, and it's very difficult to get a haircut here. Still, I see you had a fresh trim.
I did. I went to the barber specially to get a haircut after, you should have seen me a few days ago. I had a slightly longer hair.
Okay, yeah, I read some data from consumer goods companies like Unilever. Not just haircuts suffered, but the sale of deodorant went down. So some things suffer during crisis. There's some guilty pleasures though in lockdown. For me, it's doing video calls in shorts. What are your guilty pleasures during lockdown?
I assure you, I'm in appropriate attire since I'm in the office right now. But my guilty pleasure actually for the last few weeks has been just being able to just have a few more hours of extra sleep, if you know what I mean. I'm so used to starting very early in the morning, coming to the embassy and doing my rounds. But in the last few weeks, because I've had to work from home due to the restrictions imposed here in Berlin, I've been able to, just catch a few more hours of sleep. And that has been really great. But that also means that I've been sleeping much later as well.
Okay, very good. Maybe somebody will bring a coffee in a minute into the office. We've read a lot about and felt firsthand changes to how we conduct business because of lockdowns and corona crisis. I'd be curious, in the world of diplomacy, if you will, your industry, what has changed most markedly?
Well, I mean, the most obvious change of it is, the inability to meet people as regularly as we used to. For most diplomats, we are quite used to seeing each other at evening receptions. We host lunch meetings, dinners, and all that. So obviously, the last 2.5 months or so, all that has changed. We have put on hold. Many of the events have either been shelved or cancelled. And you were talking just now about cash flow. That obviously also affects the embassy's cash flow, and we've had to relook at a lot of our finances. I run a very small embassy. There are only about 6 Singaporeans working with me here in Berlin, and we've had to crack our heads to look at the way we conduct our normal operations and say, look, in this COVID atmosphere, how should we do things differently? And really, this webinar, this that we are having today, Turning Crisis into Opportunity, actually stem from that process. We usually host a startup reception in Berlin every year for the last 3 to 4 years that I've been here. And we were beginning to plan for this year's event when the COVID happened. And so quickly we had to think about, if we have to discontinue the event, were there other ways that we could reach out to the startup community here in Berlin and here in Germany? And, quickly it became very clear to us that this was a webinar, online virtual platform was the most logical. And, today's event is a very clear example with speakers from who are now currently in Singapore, of course, but also in Philippines, and you are in London, I'm in Berlin. And there are certain advantages. We are able to bring so many people, and I want to thank all the parties, all the audience who are watching, tuning into this webinar, who are from other places in the world. We would not have been able to have this opportunity to engage you if we had a normal reception at the embassy.
You were just mentioning cash flow, and one advantage here is I remember how much Singapore sling was flowing at the last event, and you're pretty much saving on that one right now, Ambassador.
Yes, we are. After a while, we had so many people consume the beers and the Singapore sling. The cash flow didn't look like that positive to us. But we were quite happy to share with, of course, all our guests Singapore sling. But it takes a lot of time to organize an event. There's so much planning that needs to be done, and at some point, like any business or startup, you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Are you meeting your objectives, your business objectives or your organizational objectives? And we in the embassy ask ourselves the same questions as well. So I think this year's COVID has really given us an opportunity to review what we have been doing and ask ourselves some really hard questions like, is there another way of doing things? I think it's very important not to be too held down by certain setbacks. We are so used, humans being creatures of habit. We are very used to doing things in a certain way. And sometimes when we have a challenge like this, it forces us to rethink and reinvent ourselves.
Just very, very briefly, you just compared your own embassy to a startup. Some people have compared Singapore, the nation, to a startup. Born during crisis, nimble, fast moving. Anything else that would fit the bill here?
Yeah, in many ways, I think Singapore is a good analogy and a good example. We were founded in August 1965, and the immediate years were very, very tough for us. There wasn't really a pandemic, but the social economic levels were very low. The British decided to pull out of Singapore, and if you think about the comparisons, it was a survival, a challenge for us in the early years too. And no one really gave us much hope. And in some ways, if you think about startups, that's very much the case, right? You go knocking at the venture capitalists, you knock at your angel investors' doors, and people say, there's so dime a dozen of startups. Why should I invest in you? And then you look at your own own business and you look at your own ideas and then you see your competitors. We went through that same process, but I think it took us a lot of grit and determination. And of course, in Singapore's case, you know, we've focus very much on the foundations, making sure that we have a world-class workforce, making sure that our education system was top rate, and then we made very careful investments. And then day by day, year by year, we were able to grow. And today, you know, you have the success story that you see in Singapore.
Ambassador, thank you so much for getting us together. And I know you'll be with us for the whole of the event. And now let's meet our speakers. And as I prepared with them, they shared with me 3 animals. And the animals we talked about in preparation were dinosaurs, camels, and chameleons. And what they mean with that, we will figure out in the next couple of minutes. First of all, welcome, Dr. Andreas Schmidt. Andreas, he is CEO of Proteona, a biotech company. And by the way, it is not the first one that he's built in Asia, in the US, in Europe. Also, he's really good at collecting money from venture capital firms. First question already came in. Isn't it hard to get money from VCs right now in the crisis? Probably it is, but if you want to know how, just ask Andreas in a bit. And earlier on, he said, hey, Andreas, for me, there are now 2 types of venture capital firms. The first one, that's the type dinosaur. You write to them with a proposal and they write back, difficult, let's speak in 6 months. The other would write back, hey, tell me why I should invest next week. Andreas, welcome. Good to have you.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Also, yeah, it's great. I think you dialed in from Germany, from Cologne. And then we have Klaus Karthe here, who's currently in Manila. He's co-founder and CEO of German Entrepreneurship Asia. So his job is to connect the innovation ecosystems of Asia and Europe. That means more practically to find new markets, help startups find new talents, and of course, new investors. And if you ever wondered what is really a global citizen, well, here he is. He lived in Finland, Germany, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Singapore. And yeah, he is the guy with the camels, because he says frugality is king now for startups. Be a camel. If capital is your water, drink and conserve as much as you can. Welcome, Klaus Karthe. And then we have with us Heng Soon Pang. He is head of venture building for SGInnovate, our host. And he has a lot of experience. Yeah, the opposite experience from Andreas, really, because he was the guy handing out the money and the check. He has considerable experience in venture capital, technology, startup investments. And he's not focused on the next marketing automation app. For him at the moment, it's about deep tech, technology with startups that invest in research, that build genuine intellectual property. He himself is a trained engineer, studied in Hamburg in Germany. And he says, well, I'm inventing this, but it fits the bill. We needed a 3rd animal. Be a chameleon, because investors now want you to show how you can adapt in a crisis. Heng, it's so good to have you with us. Let's bring this back to Andreas, right? You want these emails from investors saying, okay, great, convince me, send me money. But Andrea, let's be honest, brutally honest. If you were an investor and you may need to raise money yourself, your portfolio was just written down, the last thing I want to do is send money to you, right?
Well, we're in the middle of a crisis right now. And I think also VCs have to look for, okay, how do we get out of it? And are there the superstars of tomorrow that you mentioned earlier that can be born in a crisis? And we had to ask it ourselves as well. How are we relevant as a startup? How are we hyper relevant? And I mean, in a sentence, what we are doing is typically helping cancer patients find the right drug for their devastating disease. We realized that these are exactly the people that are at the very much highest risk of COVID-19 and complications for that. It was clear for us within a day to switch to say, okay, how do we help cancer patients that have a cancer of the immune system to fight this infection much better. And I think we have a pretty good solution of how to do that with our protective antibodies for cancer patients.
So what you have done is you pivoted very quickly once you saw that this is a new niche where we can be relevant in the crisis.
Yes. So, I mean, we simply asked what is the most relevant thing we can do? And that's obviously saving lives.
And there's just a very recent study from France. 80% of startup service said, yes, we did some kind of pivot in the crisis, just like Andreas did with his company, Proteona. Let's maybe bring this to Heng. When you hear about this adaptability, the whole chameleon thing, why do you look for adaptability, and what signals adaptability of a startup to you as an investor?
Well, what are the startups going to be adapting to? All right. You just specifically zoom in on this COVID-19 situation, right? One dimension would be immediately in front of us would be the healthcare and the healthcare system. All right. How do you manage this situation? How do you avoid the collapse of the healthcare system, for example? So that's in our face right at this point in time, a very immediate need. A little bit, behind, in timing wise, would be perhaps a medium to long term situation where startups and their business models have to adapt to living constantly with some of the changes that are being brought about that will be long lasting. And further out, perhaps a little bit longer out would be, things that what do you do? How do city-states like Singapore, for example, think about their planning of how do you plan for the urban planning of the country, transportation, for example, in terms of controlling certain perhaps future pandemics. So this is kind of a immediate, near-term and longer-term kind of adaptations or situations that companies have to adapt to. And I have some examples later on to kind of highlight what I mean.
So what I take from both of you, Andreas and Heng, is as a startup, look out to the world. Don't be all inward looking and only the cost cutting and how do I save my business model, but look to the world and ask yourself, what does the world now and in the future need more of? And what does the world need less of? And that's where my new niche might be. Let's maybe push this to Claus. Any examples that come to your mind, companies that have done that well in the last couple of weeks, months, maybe?
Pivoting to the new, yeah. I mean, it's hard from our experience in looking into the German accelerator. We have seen a few companies also in the telemedicine area, which decided to pivot their business model, right? By, for instance, being able to produce certain proteins of what is now needed in the COVID situation. So we see this basically a little bit similar to what Andreas is describing. We have seen that in our startups. I mean, the old examples is of course what is internet today, what allows us to do. And I think the focus for most startups where we see a lot of success is the whole area of telemedicine, basically allowing the working from home, distant learning. I think these are areas where future will play, and what we see now is an accelerated future. So to me, the whole concept of COVID, what we call the crisis now, is an accelerated sort of constructive destruction. So some startups will not survive this crisis, and those are probably the startups which business model was maybe already a little bit questionable and who were living off the exuberance of a lot of venture capital money and so on. And I think going back to our example of the camels, right? I think the ones which are basically now frugal, but also very adaptable, listening to their clients, trying to find out what they need. I mean, if you think most multinationals will adapt much slower to a crisis like COVID, And startups should be taking the lead here, and they should actually talk to their customers very quickly and try to find out, how can I help you right now? You know, what is the piece you need? Yeah?
What I hear from you is crisis as a catalyst, really bad news for dumb VC money, for silly business models, and good for everybody else because they go away. Let's maybe look at examples, and Heng, you suggested one, and after that, let's take Andreas as an example. Heng, what do you see out there at the moment?
Let me pick the first situation that I mentioned just now. You know, how do you, the transformation of hospital operations and the constant monitoring and tracking of the disease outbreak, right? I will just kind of throw out two examples from our current portfolio. The first one is a growth stage company, VC backed, you know, and they already have an AI analytics platform that is used to monitor patients suffering from comorbidities, you know, and started with the cardiac space, and they are also into the
so maybe for everybody, comorbidity means they get an illness, but they have other illnesses.
Yes,
at
other
the same
symptoms.
time.
Yeah, at the same time, right? And the coronary syndromes, COPD, which is a congestion of the lungs, and chronic pain. So there is such a platform that they are in the market with. And very recently, you know, its technology has been in use, you know, to remote monitor and the good surveillance in an Asian location involving patients diagnosed with COVID or suspected of COVID-19. All right. So it is a quick adaptation. It was adapted in less than 2 weeks. Right. In under a month, they had a new application out there, and the fundamental applications are already FDA approved. So with this, clinicians who are tackling this COVID thing have another, you know, a better decision support tool. So the value from a VC, if you ask me as a VC, the value proposition of this company is already strong and clearly evident. But with this new development, it is, you know, again, revalidated and even enhanced. All right.
Okay. Now, something very similar, Heng, I think happened to Andreas. We were talking about acceleration, and you had a first-hand experience of things that would usually take years happen in days.
Yeah, it's very true. And I mean, what Claus earlier said, startups had to be leaders in this situation. It's completely true. Startups can be fast and nimble. And typically as a startup, you're always in the position that you have to chase the big guys, big pharma companies, big biotech companies. So we set out, like a few weeks ago, a press release. We built a global alliance to create protective antibodies for cancer patients that are in the threat of getting COVID-19.
And just a quick question. Sorry, quick question. So the idea here would be that these antibodies can help somebody who's infected with COVID, and in particular, somebody who also has cancer.
Yes. So people that have cancer of the immune system, so they can't fight off an infection. So it's even worse.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we said, well, we are fast. We have some amazing technologies to do research on that, and we need a lot of other puzzle pieces to get to that. And then you get calls or like a quick email from like the big biotech companies, for example, Twist Bioscience, saying, okay, we are in it with you. How can we support? And I said, no, this is wrong. Typically, we are supposed to chase you and convince you and have 10 phone calls before finally we can talk about a draft of an agreement. And they really followed through.
Why is it the other way around now, Andreas?
It relates to the first sentence I said. Startups are nimble, fast, and should be the leaders in a crisis where the things change. And that's something we can do well. We can change our business model within a day and can bring pieces together, no matter if we have them or not. If we have the vision, the leadership, and a cool base technology that can make it possible.
Now, not every company has the benefit of having technologies that so perfectly fits the need of the time. And Claus, I'm sure many of the companies that you work with and which the German accelerator supports, they knock on your door with questions. What are they asking? And do you think they're asking the right questions at the moment?
I think they ask the right question. So what we see is across the board, we have many more applications than before, I would say, which is quite interesting. So this whole Europe to Asia has gone much stronger, from India to Japan. They do, of course, ask the question, money and so on, but typically they ask the question, can you connect me with that guy or this guy? So going back to what Andreas was saying, I think building a bigger puzzle is the key, and finding good partners is the key, and not having the idea to invent everything yourself is the key. So I think a partnering model is very important because it's so much faster. And basically what we have all the time is that the startups are asking us, can you connect me here? Can you connect me there? I need to have this, I need to have that. So, and that's what we do. That's basically what we do every day, day in, day out. And that has a little bit changed now compared to maybe 6 months ago.
So what is the change specifically? They ask more for connections?
They ask more for connections. They basically want to partner, right? Normally you want to sell, right? You have a product, you want to sell your product. I think now I see more questions. I have that piece of the puzzle, but I don't have the whole puzzle. Can you connect me to the next piece of the puzzle? So it's a different thinking now. It's not to come here and just sell what I have.
Yeah.
By the way, we already get first questions coming in, and then Andreas will jump in. And one question, by the way, from Tim Ho is, hey, is there a presentation? Are there slides? Are we just talking? Well, it's simple, Tim. We're just talking, but we want you to talk with us. So everybody, please use the chat function. You can already send your questions for the Q&A, which will start in about 10 minutes or so. So at the bottom, if you put your cursor down, you'll see chat. Just open that, and then you can type in any question. There are no silly questions, only silly answers. So I want to get a lot of questions from you, Tim, and everybody else. Andreas, you wanted to react to what Klaus said.
Yes. Once I heard it's all about partnerships right now, yes, I couldn't agree more. And often it's like this competition like really goes to the background. You can just pick up the phone and say, hey, this is what we are doing. Are you in it? These are the resources that we need. And that works with major, large companies, sometimes even pharma companies, and with smaller ones internationally. Like a few days ago, I was asked by Straits Times, so will you be no more local and create an economy around your buddies close by? Not at all. Right now, it's like shifting back and forth and trying to figure out, okay, where did the crisis not hit? Where is a lab open? Where is a family doctor that can help you with blood draws? It's very, very pragmatic, and I didn't get a single no.
Okay, so people are very open to helping. Let's hope this spirit persists. And also quick heads up, silly Andreas, that's me, the other Andreas here. I said, write your questions in the chat box. Actually, you have another box, which is Q&A, or for the German speakers, F&A, questions and answers. That's where you can put your questions in. Heng, when you listen to that, Klaus, his startups are asking different questions. Andreas, he sees an acceleration in partnering. What else are recommendations you give to your startups? They're in the deep tech space.
Just also a quick point on partnering, right? We have many companies who are at early stage, and they typically partner with their first customers, the first early adopters, all right? And in the case of healthcare, again, the use of AI in healthcare, it's take quite a while in this collaboration with your potential first or 1 or 2 users. So again, there's a situation that we have that because of the COVID-19, certain processes, yes, typically it's done in the hospital lab, on site, but because of work from home and the danger of if something goes wrong with one person in the lab, the whole lab goes down, you lose the capacity. And in this case, it is a diagnosis for cancer. So, the partner then wants to, it strengthens the partnership, because now between our early stage startup and the first users, they want to have a full-fledged solution that, allows work from home completely, all right, for pathologies. So you have to add new components to it, meeting regulations again. So that collaboration, that partner can become stronger if the company's solution, really kind of meets and kind of plugs the gap there. All right. Maybe I can go into another example of, now those two examples I've said were like kind of immediate reactions, quick adaptability, right? But from now onwards, for the foreseeable future, there will be new changes. We have to adapt for a changed world, right? So what do we build? What new things can we build for a changed world? I picked the subject of travel, for example. Travel will change, or have changed because of this event. And likewise, I think there will be an increased need for monitoring of the health for certain population segments, in many countries across the world. There will be new kind of health safety regimes, right? And many of these new regimes will be supported with digital tools, digital software. All right. I picked the example of COVID-19 because there's now talk about slow opening of travel, bubbles of travel from one place to another place, one bubble to another bubble. All right. But still, people have to be tested. Are they negative, or do they have immunity? Have they been vaccinated in time to come if there's a vaccine? All right. And you have to show the papers, all right? Give proof that you are indeed, of low risk. If this scales up, there will be an issue with the authenticity of the proof that the traveler would be able to offer. There will be fraud. Is it real? Is this piece of paper real or not?
Okay.
So blockchain comes very neatly, to play here, and it can allow kind of a digital twin of individual's test results, his hospital records, his vaccination records. So,
sorry if I jump in. So what I take from that is that existing technologies, we can find ways to apply them very quickly, and that's a chance for pivoting as well.
Yes, and this will take, based on our own estimate, probably 3 to 6 months to get a robust enough system out there for use.
That's a very, very encouraging opportunity. I would just like, as we see lots of questions coming in, Heng, kick over to some of the questions we get from the group, but a lot of them also geared to Claus. Andreas, in the meantime, quick question on mental health to a entrepreneur. Startup life is always tough, little sleep, lots of insecurity, uncertainty. The moment right now where your company seems to be benefiting to get additional momentum from the crisis, are you feeling better or worse? Is your life better or worse right now?
Sure, I do miss traveling and meeting people in person. But on the other hand, this is a time where we strive as a startup. This is where entrepreneurial DNA kicks in, and you just say, okay, let's get things done fast. So, I mean, when I look at the title, Turning Crisis into Opportunity, well, this is an opportunity for any startup to just get things done. So, well,
so I see an energetic. Okay,
yeah,
I see you energetic. Now, a couple of questions coming in. One is, guys, are you deluded? You're so positive. Claus is going like, yeah, you changed, Andreas just pivoted, and Heng, well, there's blockchain. Many startups, the reality for them is just they can't pivot, they're not hyper relevant for these times, and they go away. What are your recommendations for those guys?
I mean, to some extent, sure, it's true. We are a biotech startup, so we are somehow relevant to this crisis anyway, and that's probably why we see it from a different perspective. But it's also that if you're in a different area as a startup, your competition might fade away as well. So it might be a different way to indeed really be a camel, just like come through this crisis somehow and like rethink your startup right afterwards and be there and prepare everything.
So a follow-up to that, okay, you get prepared, but a follow-up specifically probably goes to Heng and Claus here, which was, what can governments do to save failing startups in this situation? And I'd add a personal question, should they do anything about it? After all, private enterprise, risk capital.
Yeah, if I jump in here, so I think a lot of governments are actually doing a lot. In Singapore, in Germany, I think the first time now it's also realized that startups are a source of employment, and that governments, when they think about bailouts of industries, they are not automatically forgetting the small man, because in the past, the small man was always forgotten, right? They would bail out all the big guys. So I think government has taken a different stance at large in many places, specifically in Germany and Singapore. And then I think government can help by doing a few other things. You can change some legislation, you can change some policies. Like, can I have my kids educated from home, or do they must go to school? Or do I really need to go to the doctor to get an MC? Or could we use digital technology to realize that, yes, I really have a high blood pressure right now, and maybe I shouldn't work, and the doctor can just issue an MC through blockchain and whatever means, and it's valid and it's legal and it's okay. So there is an opportunity for a new life where a lot of these technology startups develop can be very well used and could be very meaningful for the future. And government can play by changing some rules so that those technologies can be used. Right?
Lighter regulation, which can challenge vested interest and
Yes.
break the ground for using these more efficient technologies. Heng, should governments step in beyond that? Should they send money to startups that are not doing well?
Yeah, I think for as many positive examples that I can cite, there will be as many or maybe even more negative situations. But the government in Singapore has always taken a kind of let the private sector lead, but we will come in to give it a leg up, an additional leg up. All right, we don't unilaterally say, okay, yeah, you are good enough, you survive. You're not good enough, you don't survive. It is largely a private sector decision, and in the case of venture funding, there are many VC funds in Singapore. They are on this scheme that the government co-funds, a certain percentage, it could be 1:1, with alongside the private sector investors. So at the end of the day, going back to your earliest point, Andreas, it's the private sector investors would have to make the decisions based on what they see. Certainly, there is a lot of uncertainty, even from the investors' eyes. Business plans have just gone out the window. The VCs themselves, their own funding from their limited partners may also be suspect for some of them. So basically, everybody is re-evaluating the situation, and VCs still, they cannot just go into a hole and hide. All right, they have to make investments. All right, so they will pick, and if they pick, the government in Singapore can follow, can match.
Okay, so very different approaches in this crisis. In the United Kingdom, I live in London, the government hasn't been too forthcoming yet for startups. Germany maybe somewhere halfway. Another question that came was, okay guys, you're so optimistic, now is the time for partnership models, but not everybody finds partners in the biotech space like Andreas. Other firms, they are tightening belts. The large firms are tightening their belts, and they might not have the bandwidth to look for and enter partnerships with many small startups. They're not in the mood for herding cats and don't have the cash. How can VCs help make partnerships with larger companies is the question from Jenny Neo. Who has an idea here? What could VCs do for that?
I think VCs do that, actually. I mean, a good venture capital firm has the core interest to support its startups, just like what we do as an accelerator, right? We don't take any money and we don't take any equity from our startups, but we push them hard, and we are always a good advisor, right? And I think any good VC would just be the same. So they push them to corporates, they push them to POCs. I'm not sure. I think corporates have slowed down because they are confused with the situation, how to cope with it. But if you go to a board level and if you talk to a CEO, I think every CEO of every large organization will agree that this is the time where innovation is actually most needed, right? So that it has, the top knows it, right? Whether Whether the middle management basically can execute it right now, that's another question. But I think on the top level, innovation is the key, and I think it will come up right fast.
Andreas.
Yeah, I think the VCs can make the introductions. As the CEO, you in the end have to sell. And even for the very large companies, they have to show that they are relevant, that they respond to the crisis, that they don't lose their normal customer base. So maybe it comes even out of the marketing budget to say, okay, we are helping startups, we have some innovative ideas, they are brand new and we try to integrate them, we are not a dinosaur. And appealing to that, to the top management of large companies is one strategy. And for governments as well as VCs, often it's not even asking for an investment, it's asking, well, will you buy from a startup? And that's often even the better stamp of approval.
We have got an additional question here, and it's about different expectations, how this crisis unfolds. Go back to what Heng and Andreas said and Klaus said earlier on. For a startup, what matters is to be relevant, always. But in the crisis, you have to be hyper-relevant. But what will economies look like after the crisis in, say, Singapore and Asian countries and the West? We got this question here from Aditya Kapoor, and she observes that in Singapore, apparently, there are preparations for a crisis to drag out a year or two in terms of restrictions, but also economically. While when you look at many Western countries, it looks like, we'll shrug this off in a couple of months and stock markets are exuberant and we'll be through. Which reality would a startup now adapt? The Singaporean expectation or the Western expectation?
Let me take a first stab at this. All right. Whatever your expectations, go back to the point. Extend your runway by reducing your cash burn. All right, that's the best thing, that's the safest thing that we do. If it is a short interruption to normal circumstances, good. If it's a long one, you are also in good situation. So I think investors, regardless of what scenario they buy into, would always say, extend your runway, cut your burn. All right. And the Singapore situation is perhaps different. There have been many industry transformation efforts along the way already for the last few years. All right, we recognize that certain industry need to upgrade themselves, change in order to stay competitive in any case. All right, so along comes this event, this COVID-19, and it presses the situation very hard. There's no more choice. You can't push it out anymore. You got to do it like sooner rather than later. Thankfully, the government here has been able to provide the resources, both in help as well as financial resources to kind of move segments of the economy in this direction. But like you say, it does not happen in other countries, perhaps.
Okay, so no matter which model you subscribe to, quick recovery and restrictions falling away quickly, or protracted restrictions, slow recovery, in both scenarios, just spend less as a startup and reevaluate where you can be relevant. Sometimes it's as simple as that, the laws of economics. One other question we got here is learnings from past crises. And this question here is coming from KT Chong. All of you, Andreas, Klaus, and Heng, I'm sure you have been involved with failing startups. Some of you may have been the CEO. Klaus, what are the top learnings from failing that you want to share in this crisis?
So I can now happily share, because it's a long time ago, but in the last financial crisis, I was running a satellite-based maritime mobile operator, and our business model and unit economics, they were not quite sound. So little bit operating like maybe WeWork or Uber, hoping about the future. And basically the crisis destroyed us quite fast, precisely because the funding dried up. But I think the learning from that exercise was that we went out with the product a little bit too early. We didn't think it through, especially in unit economics. And obviously every startup is optimistic. So were we. So we were a little bit slower in customer acquisition. Eventually we got there. But of course, when the global trading stopped, when you're in a maritime business, then basically everything stopped. So I think the learning is, again, we should have been better with our product. I think more focused and a better unit economics. And the other learning is, I think we were not fast enough to start saving money, right? So it was really the camel thing, right? We did not quickly adopt. We were too optimistic.
Let's take your example and then also look at Andreas, because we have questions on what do you plan to do now. So maybe learnings from 10 years back that you can share with Andreas here.
Sure.
What were the first harbingers, the first signs that things were going back in the day, Klaus? And then how much later did you react, and how?
Well, first of all, we didn't have a clear understanding how long this crisis would be, right? So basically, we were installed on a few hundred merchant marine vessels, and suddenly these vessels, they lie in harbor and they don't trade anymore, right? And then you don't make money, right? And then how long will that take, and so on. So we were thinking it over much faster. So we didn't think this is a long drawn out moment. And then we didn't realize that a lot of companies, what you said in the beginning, Andreas, they didn't pay their bills anymore, right? So we also had receivables. We couldn't collect the receivables fast enough. So we had a lot of cash flow issues, and we just didn't cut our cost fast enough. And I think that was ultimately the end. We did manage to sell the technology, so we could recover something, but the business was gone.
So
right?
Klaus, if you think back, and then we'll push it over to Heng and Andreas. When should you have acted, and could you have saved the business at the time?
I think we should have acted immediately when the crisis hit. I mean, when you read in the newspaper that Maersk doesn't have business anymore, then you know you don't have business anymore when you're a supplier to Maersk, right? So this is the simple thing, and we did not, right? And could the business have survived? Probably not, because our investors were running for the trenches, right? So they didn't fund us anymore.
And we all observe how you're revisiting your own history a bit as your body language changed and you're searching, and it must have been a really stressful time for you, and the time would be now for many startups. Heng, the weird thing seems to me that to found a startup, you have to be optimistic, wildly optimistic, to think, well, most fail, but I won't. But then hits the crisis, and you would have to be the opposite. What do you observe with the startups that you work with? Are they pessimistic enough, as Klaus hopes they would be?
No, I think so far my experience has been, yes, they get hit, and some of them, because of the fundamental business, target markets, and business models are more defensible, more durable than others. So they have perhaps a little bit more buffer in terms of, okay, let me find a way out of this. All right. Some startups are already at the edge, even before any crisis. They are, in a normal situation, many startups are at the edge. They're, at any one point in time, they have very little cash balance. There's no real competitive differentiation. And they do not yet have a repeatable and scalable business model, a unit economics. So all you need is just a slight push, the whole thing collapses. And in my opinion, in the past, I have walked away with losses, big ones, where you just have to, and usually investors don't give up straight away. All right, they'll give some convertible loans, bridging loans to tie it over for another 6 months maybe, and you go for another loan and that's 12 months. But eventually, these loans would have to stop, and it's a painful decision. You walk away with several $1 million down the tubes. So, but you have to, because there's this saying, you should not put good money after bad, after you have decided it is bad. right? So the point where you say, okay, the money is now bad, is a very hard and decision that a VC has to make.
Okay, so not only the startup companies can be too optimistic, but also their backers, the VCs, can be too optimistic, and then it becomes a folie à deux, two sides being a little bit detached from reality with bad results. So that's a very tough lesson for some startups and their backers. Maybe this crisis has just exposed that this fragile business model wouldn't really work with or without COVID, but we now see it more clearly. Now, with Andreas, it's a different story because Andreas, you high times, things are going well for you. And we've got one question regarding your company, and this question is coming from Wang Ying Ting. Thank you very much for sharing. Wang's asking, after making the pivot, what are the next steps for Proteona, your company?
Well, I mean, one thing that changed dramatically is also how do we approach financing the company now? And we said, well, COVID-19 is so relevant to so many people, we will try to fund particularly that through crowd investment. And previously, I would not have considered that and looked into other ways. And now we think that's exactly the thing we should do. Our campaign will be online in a few days from now. And we think if we can help actively to get out of this crisis, that's actually a pretty good argument to have other people backing us up and, well, taking up on the upside of that as well. So crowd investment was a very specific step for us to do something different that we haven't considered a few months ago.
Interesting. So also new ways of financing springing up in this crisis. And then that might be an opportunity for anybody who's not a VC to send money your way for a couple of shares, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Now we have a couple more questions, some of them bigger than the scope of this event. For example, KWW asks, what are the panel's opinions on revenue-based financing as opposed to traditional VC equity raising? Well, in brackets, it would require some revenue at the moment. And then another question from Blomified, if I read that correctly. As a young startup, how do I effectively digitalize my business? Big questions related to crisis or also other topics. The good news for you two is we have a forum for these questions and it's coming up, because today is only the start of a series of web events which we will do on startup opportunities, Germany, Singapore, Asia, Europe. The next one is going to be the Startup Night in June, and then a MedTech event in July. And Klaus, when you hear these questions, could that be something for the Startup Night? Tell us a bit about the upcoming event.
Yeah, sure, my pleasure. So we have German Startup Night coming up 30th of June here in cooperation with SGInnovate as well. So it's part of the series we are running also with the embassy, as said, end of June. So there we have a mix of all our different programs, German Accelerator with the German startups in Singapore. We have our Southeast Asia classes. We have classes from India. We have classes from South Korea and Japan participating in the program. That obviously is an online event. Normally this is a big social event, not Singapore slings, but German beer, Weißwurst and pretzels. So, but this time you have to bring your own beer and you just have to sit in front of the screen and join us. So this is happening June 30. And then mid of July, we have a vertical acceleration program in Boston where we work with MIT. And there's a cooperation with SGInnovate where we talk about an health tech focused event, probably 13th, 14th of July, somewhere there. So this is the last event in the series, and happy to address some of the questions.
Great. So you get all of this via email if you were signed up to this event, which you were because you're part of it. Plus, if you found some bit super interesting and want to listen back to those, you will also get a video link, most likely in the next 48 hours with a recording of this event if you just can't get enough of us. And if you, after that, still couldn't get enough of our panelists, I am quite confident that they would be open to taking other questions via email if you want to approach them one-on-one. Very hard for them to say no. Anybody not open to that right now? Very good.
Send them away.
Send them
Yes.
away. If you need money, right, you need to talk to Heng. If you want to learn how to get money from VCs, talk to Andreas. And if you need other contacts, talk to Claus. In a nutshell, today we were speaking about dinosaurs, camels, and chameleons. What did I personally take away from our conversation? What I found very impressive was what Andreas said right in the beginning. As a startup, you need to be relevant to the world. If you're a very big company, there's already vested interest, you can invest into lobbying. Some of your clients might be too lazy to switch to other suppliers. You survive even when you should be dead. Not a startup. But during a crisis, as a startup, you don't just have to be relevant to the world, you have to be hyper relevant. And Heng then gave us the hint, well, look at what the world needs, and that will suggest what is hyper relevant now or what will be hyper relevant in a couple of years' time. What will change? How will we work? How will we eat? How will we love? How will we travel, if at all? And that could inspire the next groundbreaking idea. No wonder, another learning, that some of the most impressive companies on this planet were founded during times of crisis, but the statistics are a bit more granular. Unfortunately, on the whole, fewer companies that are founded during crisis survive. So maybe it really is an all-star environment where only hyper relevance to the world matters. Also, what I take away, weak business models, fortunately, get weeded out by the crisis. So if you have these nagging feelings, oh, it's not going well with my startup, maybe it is for a reason. Maybe it's a huge opportunity for you to dedicate your energy and your lifetime to something that is, again, more relevant to the world. And finally, a very sober message, but one to sink in. Spend less, and that's not just the Singapore slings. Everybody, thank you so much for spending time with us today. More questions might come to you directly, and big thanks also to SGInnovate, who hosted, who organized, to the ambassador of the Embassy of Singapore to Germany, Laurence Bay, and of course to Wei Min, who skillfully managed all the technology in the background. Thank you so much for the support and for hosting us. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andreas.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, all the attendees that have been with us till now. Okay, so for the end of the event, we will be sending out a post-event mail, which will consist of the event link, YouTube link to today's recording. And for any other questions which you may want to raise, you may reply or send an email to us at events@sginnovate.com. And that's it for today. So once again, thank you all the speakers. Thank you, Andreas, for the wonderful and very engaging session for today's webinar.
Thank you.
Okay, right. With that, we will conclude today's session. Thank you, everyone, to Germany, to Singapore, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Thanks, Wei Min.
All right, the broadcast has been stopped. Is there anything we should discuss now, post-event, or just jump off?
I think Wei Min looks frozen.
Okay. Well, we can always jump on the WhatsApp chat, and then a big thanks, Lydia, also to you for your support and for being with us today.
No problem. Thanks so much for moderating the session.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.